I'm just going to spend a few moments setting the stage here. So as I'm sure you're all very well aware, invasive species are a huge and growing problem in terrestrial environments as well as in marine environments. Most invasive species in the marine environment to date have been sessile invasive species, things like seaweeds, bivalves, and tunicates. And this is where most of the efforts on researching management strategies has been put into to date. And so we can see that reflected here on these sessile species from this sampling of Canadian marine invasive species. And there haven't been too many mobile invaders in the marine environment to date, but those that do exist, like those down here, tend to be predators with disproportionate impacts on ecosystems they invade. So one good example is here in the corner, European green crab, which has invaded many habitats in North America with impacts on shellfish and eelgrasses. And there's also a growing number of marine invasive fish predators, which have even higher mobility. For example, sea lamprey in the Great Lakes, Indo-Pacific lionfish in the Caribbean, and peacock grouper in Hawaii. And when predators, or when invasive predators, when invasive species become mobile, behavior suddenly becomes a much more important driver of population dynamics and overall invasion dynamics. And this is true at both regional and local scales. So at regional scales, and for marine invasive species in particular, most of the invasive dispersal will originally be driven by larval transport on ocean currents that act as conveyor belts to new regions. But adult movement can actually help to accelerate regional spread by bridging gaps in oceanic circulation and accelerating spread into new current areas that would otherwise, these gaps might have slowed down some of the invasive spread. And then at local scales is where most of the management of these species occurs, usually by physical removal or culling. But culling is really labor intensive, and so it usually needs to be done at a limited set of times and places. And then it needs to also be repeated over time as these habitats are recolonized by individuals from other patches or outside areas. But there's actually been very little guidance on exactly which individuals, which patches, and which time periods to cull at, especially in the marine environment. And there hasn't been very much consideration of how behavior could impact management outcomes in these species. So I'm going to walk you through an example today, a case study of where we tried to do this. We tried to incorporate the behavioral understanding of the species into management strategies. And so what I'm going to do is walk you through a bit of the context of this invasion, and then a prior movement study that set up some of the foundations for the current work. And then I'll turn to how we could incorporate this information into management planning. So in a nutshell, the Indo-Pacific lionfish was introduced from Southeast Asia into South Florida, most likely through the aquarium trade in the early 80s, early 90s. And it has since spread rapidly throughout the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. And it's had quite large impacts on the habitats that's invaded. Because they are quite voracious predators, they eat a lot of fish, including in some cases fish up to half their own body size. And some studies have shown that they are capable of removing upwards of 60% of the biomass on some of the reefs that they've invaded. But the problem is that they have no predators of their own in the invaded range, in part due to physical defenses, such as these venomous spines up here. So this invasion is quite far gone. There's really no more possibility of eradication. So management is focused on local control in sensitive areas, for example, juvenile fish nurseries. And it's carried out through physical removal or culling, as I alluded to before, either by managers or through these organized fishing contests or spearfishing derbies. There has been a little bit of guidance so far on exactly where these should take place. So some guidance was released by the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute in 2012. And there is a little bit of a nod to behavior in this guidance, where they recommend some alternative strategies to target areas of high colonization, if you're interested in reducing ongoing impacts, or low colonization if you're interested in revisiting sites less frequently between removals. But in general, there's not really much operational detail in this guidance. They don't specify exactly how you would identify sites of high colonization or high management value. And so in practice, a lot of the management that does take place still is quite opportunistic and haphazardly distributed. So what we wanted to do, and part of the reason why this management advice is so vague, is because at the time the guidance was released, we didn't really know that much about lionfish movement behavior. And I would say the same is true for a lot of other marine invasive species. And so to try to fill some of that gap, we carried out a movement study on these species in their invaded range. So we did this work in an island called Eleuthera in the Bahamas, in two contrasting types of habitat: patchy reef habitat, where these patches of reef are distributed over large expanses of sand, which fish generally don't like to cross, and then a continuous reef habitat where movement is much easier. And so we tagged these fish and released a bunch of them in both of these habitats, and then went back and did surveys at regular intervals to see where they moved. And so what we found, that's not too surprising, is that movement was influenced by the connectivity of these landscapes. So there's much less movement in these patchy habitats, and fish tend to spread by quick sporadic jump dispersal, and in continuous reefs it's much slower and steadier diffusion process. But what we also found that was surprising was that these fish were 10 to 100 times more mobile than previously reported. They'd previously been thought to be quite sedentary. And if we compare that to some similarly sized native reef fish predators, we can see that lionfish are quite dramatically more mobile than the native predators of roughly similar size in similar habitats. And so one reason this might be, that might be likely, is that lionfish possess a lot of traits, including large body size, these physical defenses, and they're also extremely tolerant to fasting that will reduce their probability of mortality during dispersal. And so this makes them quite bold dispersers, and it's likely contributed to their invasion success. And so once a fish decides to move, how does it decide where to end up? And it turns out that that has a lot to do with how many other lionfish are on these destination patches, because scenes like this very rarely happen in nature. And so they do move down density gradients, down individual and biomass density gradients. And what we found is that not all lionfish moved in exactly the same way. When we looked at movement as a function of body size, we see that it's actually these intermediately sized fish that are responsible for the bulk of movement, both in patch habitat and to a lesser degree in the continuous reef habitat down here. And it seems counterintuitive at first, because most ecologists expect that larger individuals will have a larger capacity for dispersal. And this is true, but it does make sense if you think about it in terms of the costs and benefits of movement. So these really small fish here, while they might really benefit from moving to a higher quality patch, they don't really have the capacity to do so. They can't, or too small to cross these large expanses of sand, and so they don't. And these larger fish, while they do have the ability to cross these large distances, they might not need to, because a lot of them already occupy the highest quality habitat and are capable of competitively displacing smaller fish. So we're left with these intermediately sized individuals that have the highest potential benefit of moving with the least associated costs relative to other size classes. And this is more generally true of a lot of other animals. They need to make these individual dispersal decisions in the face of trade-offs between the benefits of moving to a higher quality patch and at the same time increasing the potential risk of competition or predation while doing so. So having learned a bit more about the movement behavior of the species, what we really wanted to know is how we could now use this information to inform management. And we know from the invasive species literature that invasive species population dynamics are influenced by local recruitment, adult movement, and landscape connectivity, and that ideally all three of these things are taken into account when carrying out the timing and locations of management activities. And the relationship between adult movement and landscape connectivity in particular is becoming increasingly important in this increasingly fragmented world we live in, both on land and in the sea. And so we really need some tools to be able to incorporate the effects of movement behavior with landscape connectivity to make some inferences about the best approaches to management. And so one potential tool for doing that is metapopulation theory. So metapopulation theory was developed to describe how patchy subpopulations are connected by movement and how overall network connectivity might influence population persistence in the long term. And it's a really powerful framework for working with invasive species, because it can help us to answer questions such as which of these patches might be most important to conduct management at. And so there are many different types of metapopulation models out there, but one of the most popular for practical management applications is one called the incidence function model, or IFM. and I'll take you a bit through how that works in a moment. And so the incidence function model, like many of the models that have been discussed at this conference, was developed originally to identify critical habitat for endangered and threatened species, and then be able to earmark that habitat for protection or restoration. And what the central idea of this talk and what I'm proposing is that we can also use these kinds of models in reverse to identify critical habitat for invasive species and then target that habitat to drive them more quickly to extinction. So how does it work? So again, the metapopulation model, the incidence function model, was developed by Ilkka Hensky at the University of Helsinki. It's quite a simple model, and it's able to be parameterized using relatively few kinds of easily obtained field data on patch area, patch coordinates, the presence or absence of species at patches over multiple time steps, and then some information on the dispersal of your species of interest. And it's been most famously parameterized and tested on the Glanville fritillary butterfly in Finnish meadows, but it's since been tested and validated for many other species, including mammals, birds, amphibians, and even some plants. And here's a little bit, bear with me for these equations, here's how it works. So the main output of this model is something we call incidence. So that's the long-term probability that any given patch I will be occupied. It ranges from 0 to 1. And that's influenced by colonization and extinction. And colonization is a function of connectivity, which has to do with how the patches are distributed in space and the movement ability of the species. And extinction is a function of patch area. So some simple substitution across these equations yields one master equation where we have incidence, a colonization term, and an extinction term. And then we're left with a few modifying parameters which are obtained from fitting the model. So these parameters, E, Y, and X, are informative in and of themselves. They can be compared across different species. E gives a measure of the extinction vulnerability, so how fast a species goes extinct as patch size declines. Y is a measure of colonization ability, where lower Y are associated with higher colonization ability that is more independent of patch isolation. And X gives you an idea of the relative importance of environmental stochasticity versus demographic stochasticity in terms of how that affects extinction. And then we use the data to fit the model, a linearized version of the model, like so in R. And one of the really powerful aspects of this model is that once you have these parameters fitted for your species of interest, you can use it to simulate incidences in new or hypothetical patch networks. So you can actually add or remove patches and test some potential outcomes of alternative management strategies, which is really interesting for invasive species. So now that we've looked at the model, the question now is to ask whether lionfish are a suitable model organism to use this model in, whether they meet the conditions. And it turns out, in fact, they do, and that invasive species, in fact, more often meet the conditions of these types of metapopulation models than the threatened species that they were originally developed for. And some of these conditions includes, as we've seen, living in patchy habitats. So 30% of lionfish populations are expected to exist in these kinds of patchy habitats. They have infrequent movements between the patches, as we saw. They have fast patch dynamics, which just means movements within a patch are faster than movements between patches. They're expected to be at a roughly population equilibrium for invasive species in unmanaged areas. You can imagine how this is easily violated for a lot of threatened species. And these are relatively easy to detect. They're unafraid of divers because of their venomous spines, and so they're easily detected with targeted surveys with low detection errors. So having checked those conditions, we can now fit the model. So here's some of our input data from the tracking study. So we get the mean dispersal distance to get our dispersal parameter alpha. We also obtain from that data the occupancy at each patch at 2 different time periods, so presence or absence at 2 time periods. And then we can get the patch areas and pairwise distances from satellite photography as well as GPS data from the field. And in this case, we scaled patch areas to lionfish density as a proxy for habitat quality, which is something that is permitted in the original formulation of the model. And so now that we've sort of set up this model, we were really interested in answering 3 questions with it. We wanted to know whether we could use this model to first just plainly predict the occupancy probability of network patches and use that to investigate heterogeneity across patches in terms of some preliminary information on where to target management. Then we're interested in seeing if it could be used to determine how occupancy is influenced by changes in the network. So addition or removal of a patch, where removal of a patch can be used to simulate consistent culling of that patch. And finally, we wanted to know how occupancy or incidence is influenced by changes in the dispersal behavior itself, which could be driven by things like size selective culling, which I'll explain a bit further in a moment. So we'll look at each case one at a time. So first we fit the baseline incidences using our field data. And so what you're about to see in this plot is a series of circles which represent the patches and how they're distributed in the landscape. The size of the patch will be proportional to the size of the patch in nature. And then the numbers that you'll see are just ID numbers, so you can disregard those. And then they will be shaded by this DC colors for incidence, where an incidence of 1 indicates that if you looked at that patch 10 times, it would be occupied every time. And lower incidence means that it would be occupied less of the times that you went to visit it. So here are the outcomes for that initial fitting. And you can already see a lot of heterogeneity across these patches that start to give us some preliminary information about where to target our management. And then remember that this step also yields our parameter estimates for Y, E, and X. And so the benefits of this step is that it helps you to identify some of those patches that are more important than others, and it starts to get at this place of giving you some information relevant to the guidance that's been provided for managing this species. But we can see that a lot of these patches have really similar incidents, and it's not clear whether they are equally as important for management. So to try to get at that, we did some simulation modeling where we removed each of these patches one at a time and reran the model to see how the incidence changed. So I'm going to show you examples for removal of a large patch here and a small patch here. So here's the before and here's the after, and you can see how the incidence has changed in both of these networks. It's a little difficult to see the change using just these same heat colors, but it's easier to visualize if you just look at the difference between those cases, so the delta J, where here blue is a decrease in incidence and red is an increase. And so we can see that the patches surrounding the patch that was removed have a declined probability of finding lionfish in the future. And this kind of network-wide benefit is really difficult to summarize with a single kind of descriptor. So the mean of both of these cases is roughly the same, even though they don't look the same. And so what we did was to get a more accurate estimate of the network level cumulative benefit of removal at this one patch. We borrowed a metric from pharmacology called the area under the curve, or the AUC, which is plotted in these insets. And that's just the area under a plot of the change in incidence at each patch over the distance away from the patch that was removed. And this gives us a more informative single value summary of the cumulative benefit of management, but it also lets us visualize the distance to cumulative effect of managing in a single patch. And so if we repeated this for all the patches, you can also plot the AUC by patch. And this starts to now give you a really good sense of if you're doing a quick and dirty triage as a manager, where you should focus your efforts for initial removal for this species if your resources are limited. And then the patterns that we're seeing on these plots are something called a halo effect, where you're seeing benefits beyond the area where you manage. And you can imagine, if you're able to predict what that might look like, you could select sites to manage that produce overlapping halo effects to get the most bang for your buck. And so part of the benefit of this method, or this step, is that it helps you quantify what those halo effects might look like, both alone and in combination. And it helps you select the best patches to target for maximum network level effects. And so finally, we wanted to look at the effects of size selective culling. In this species, as with many other species, culling or harvesting tends to be size selective towards larger body sizes, in part because larger fish are just easier to find. They may have higher values of food fish. This invasive species is edible and it is delicious. They may have higher rewards in these derbies or fishing contests that are used to control them. And larger fish are seen as more impactful predators, which they are, and so they tend to be seen as having the highest benefit of removal, and so removals target those. But as we saw earlier, not all fishes of all sizes are moving in the same way, and so what we wanted to know is how might size selective culling, if you're removing some of these size classes that are more responsible for dispersal, how might that affect overall incidence and population dynamics? And so what we did is we took the original set of tagged fish and we cut out some of the size classes, and then we calculated new dispersal parameters using just the data for remaining fish And we did that for removal of the largest size class and the intermediate size class, which is most mobile, and then both the intermediate and the largest size class. And then we reran those models to see how the incidence would change. So what we see here in this first plot is I'm showing the differences in incidence between the baseline case where all size classes are present and the case where this one size class has been removed. So what we can see right away is that removing just the largest size classes doesn't really have that much influence on the long-term incidence in this network, and that's because these large fish are not really contributing much to connectivity in this network. But removing these more mobile, intermediately sized fish does have more significant impacts. There's a reduction in incidence at many patches, but you'll see that there's also an increase in incidence at these smaller, more tightly clustered patches that become more important sort of sub-networks of their own when connectivity is lower. And then removing them both really has not that much more effect than removing just the most mobile size class. And then what we also did was we looked at the effect of management at a single patch against the new background of a network where mobility has been reduced. So against a background with the largest lionfish already removed, if you then remove at a single patch, it produces similar effects as in the original case with all size classes present because connectivity has not changed very much. But when you remove those most mobile size classes and then go ahead and do management at a specific patch, you see the halo effect really becomes much more muted than before, and that's just because the population is less connected to begin with. So one of the takeaways from this last step that I really want to emphasize is that in a species where movement is size dependent, culling of a specific size class can fundamentally change the connectivity of the network and influence population dynamics in that way. And this has implications for management depending on what your priorities are. So if you're interested in reducing the impacts of feeding at a specific site, you might want to go ahead and target those big fish as before. But if you're more interested in reducing spread or recolonization of a site, it might be better to actually target intermediately sized individuals. And finally, I want to wrap up with a few interesting extensions or noting where the work could go from here. So one possible benefit of this work is it could be used for hypothesis generation to test alternative management scenarios. These could be easily tested in the field, either in a natural reef network or in artificial reef networks, experimental reef networks. And it can also be used in part of an adaptive management framework to periodically readjust strategies as removals proceed over time and the population might reach, for example, a new stable state. And this really is, I see this as a first step towards evidence-based invasive species management, which there have been increasing calls for in the literature. Another potential thing you could do with this approach is use it on multiple species and look for overlaps between critical habitats of the invasive species and a threatened species to look for places where your culling will have the most impact on patches that also have the greatest conservation need. And then last but not least, I thought this was really cool. Just this past year, a group used the IFM to model how connectivity and population impacts of development projects through environmental assessment process. So this is a map of different green spaces in the surrounding area around Nottingham. And what they did is that they fit the IFM across these patches for a range of threatened species that inhabit this area. And then they looked at how the incidence and long-term persistence of the populations changed when some of these sites were converted into human developments as part of the city's development plan. And so for many of them, the population persistence declined, others were more resilient. But what's interesting about this for invasive species is that some of these new habitats or some of these new developments might actually be creating new habitat because for many invasive species, including lionfish, are actually really good at exploiting artificial substrates. And so in conclusion, I just want to reiterate that the invasion dynamics of invasive species are really an emergent property of the individual dispersal decisions that they're making, which are in turn driven by population demography, environmental quality, and patch connectivity. And that I think it's really important that we start to incorporate the behavior of invasive species into management planning for them to make the most of limited management resources and achieve better management outcomes. With that, I'd like to thank my collaborators and funders, and thank all of you for listening. I'm happy to take questions.
lovely talk. Thank you, Natascia.